question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Chifley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This is not the first Closing the Gap speech that I've heard where the observation has been made that more needs to be done to actually allow Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population to have a greater say in the programs or the initiatives that governments undertake that affect them. I've heard this a number of times now. A number of us have heard how it's important that communities have a greater sense of control, ownership and drive the direction of the funding that is allocated to ensure that they meet their needs and aspirations. And I begin my contribution then, reflecting on that, by asking the question, why? And the question is directed specifically to this. In an environment where these questions are being posed and where people are being asked as to why Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are not given greater say and control in terms of the funding that's in particular driven by the Closing the Gap initiatives. But we have a situation proudly in this nation where we have, for the first time, an Aboriginal Minister for Indigenous Affairs. And we have, for the first time, as a shadow minister, at that same time serving in the shadow minister for Indigenous Affairs being Aboriginal as well. And yet neither of them have been accorded the opportunity to deliver the Closing the Gap addresses, the formal ones. Yeah. We have a Prime Minister deliver it, and we have a Leader of the Opposition deliver it, yet we do not have Aboriginal people standing at the dispatch box delivering this speech. And this is would be a powerful reflection, I would submit, that Aboriginal people get to report on whether or not the things that have been said would be done, would be achieved and would be set aside to help Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders be achieved is being achieved. Yeah. And for those people who say, well, it's important for a Prime Minister and a Leader of Opposition to deliver those speeches, I would say this. If that's the case, why is the most preeminent economic document of the country, the budget, delivered not by the Prime Minister but by one of the Prime Minister's ministers? True. So if this document is supposed to be a powerful representation of parliamentary and administrative will to ensure that we work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to see an improvement across a range of measures, then I think this should be done. And I certainly think an Indigenous Minister for Indigenous Affairs and that person's counterpart be accorded that respect, because they should be able to speak up for their communities in this of most fundamental ways. Yeah. Because clearly we are not achieving. On many respects, yes, we have made some progress, but we need to do more. And I must say too, there was an element, as I was listening to the Prime Minister's address, I could not shake the feeling that we were being prepared for something which would be akin to maybe, possibly, watering down the targets and not setting the ambitions. Yeah. And I have to also say it was very telling that when the Leader of the Opposition, when Labor Leader Anthony Albanese said that these are not someone else's targets, that they are our targets that we are failing, the opposition itself spoke unanimously as one to say yes, not because this was a partisan point that was being made. I would actually stress nothing could be further from the truth, but there's certainly a very strong feeling amongst many of us in the opposition, and I suspect there are many in the government as well, that we can and should do better, and there should be no dilution of the targets whatsoever. We should press for better, because the reality is, when we look at the way that things have happened, we cannot. We are done with turning our back. Yeah. You know, we have turned, as our nation, our back on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders for too long. You know, even simply on the history of this nation, we have done this. You know, I have to say, I read two powerful books in the course of the last 12 months. One written by Stan Grant, that he'd written quite a few years ago, where he reflected on the fact that he felt his history, he had not been made aware of it growing up, and when he had been made aware of it, had been quite moved by it, and also felt as an individual he should be able to express quite clearly his dissatisfaction with the way that he and the people that he loves have been treated in the way that they have been in times past, and that we as a nation should be able to face up to this without any sense of guilt. And secondly, Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, which a number of people have said has moved them. But in particular, that book, what it did was to highlight the fact that we are, so much of us as a people, completely and utterly unaware of the way in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people lived their lives in very complex systems prior to colonisation. And to recognise this is not some failing of the nation. It is not an admission of guilt. It is not assigning blame. It is just doing the right thing respectfully by people and ensuring that, in many respects, what had been undertaken before, by refusing to acknowledge what had happened prior to the arrival of the British in this nation, that this was in a way a mechanism to deny legitimacy to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And this is important in the context of what we are going through now, in that this cannot be some sort of mechanistic, the Closing the Gap is not some sort of mechanistic or bureaucratic or consultant-led initiative where we tick a few boxes. This is about understanding that in many respects what has happened in the past has contributed in many respects to the disadvantage we've seen today, and that in acknowledging this, we, as I said earlier, are not, people should not feel blame. When we're discussing, for example, verses of the national anthem or the day in which Australia Day falls, and there are some people who will attempt to claim that in some way, shape or form, people today are being made to feel like they are responsible, they should wear guilt, they are to blame. No, this is about respect. This is about fundamentally acknowledging the pain of peoples before us, that if the roles were reversed and we had experienced this, we would do it. And if you don't think it's important that that be done, why do you go to Anzac Day ceremonies? Right. Because for the same reason we respect the sacrifice and the pain that was inflicted on one generation of Australians through that conflict, we should also rightly acknowledge what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples went through, and we should also acknowledge through the Closing the Gap process what we are failing to achieve. And there should be two things that happen. We should not just have simply, and I must say this has been something that we have wrestled with for many years, but this attempt that the only way we'll fix things is practical reconciliation. As a people, we are moved by symbols. We are absolutely moved by symbols. It's why we have that flag in the corner. It's why we have that crest up there. It's why we do the prayer every day and the acknowledgement of country. Symbols matter to people. And certainly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the issue of recognition in our Constitution is an important thing. It is not just should not be reduced to, we don't need to do this, we need to achieve practical reconciliation first. We should do both things. Yep. We should be able to do that. And we should be able to find a way in this nation that we have an ability, recognising the Uluru Statement and the statement from that, we should be able to find a way to incorporate an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice in this place, yep, in the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are calling for. Now, I've got someone in my office who's done a lot of work to go through the Closing the Gap speech and pick out key stats, and I thank him for his work. But I just felt that this within terms of the Closing the Gap and where this sits in terms of the way that we are actually reconciling with the people that were here first in this land, that we do need to do better, and we cannot see a watering down of the targets. We cannot walk away from our failure either in meeting those targets or in acknowledging the pain of peoples who were here before us. and that ambition in this space is something that we should walk towards, not away from.
I thank